at a minute's notice, will be there. It was a promise made in a different time, by a different people, for a different world. A promise of immediate aid, of common defense, of a community bound not by law or edict, but by a shared belief in mutual survival. In the blasted, irradiated landscape of the Commonwealth, that promise was a flickering candle in a hurricane, a whisper against a nuclear gale. It was the creed of the Minutemen. But what happens when the promise is broken, the candle is snuffed out, and the whisper fades into a scream of betrayal and loss? What becomes of an ideal when its last adherents are scattered to the winds, hunted and broken? This is the story of that ideal, of its death and its unlikely rebirth. It is the story of how a simple concept, that people should be empowered to defend their own homes, their own neighbors, their own future, proved to be the most resilient force in a world determined to grind all hope to dust. To understand the Minutemen of the post-apocalyptic Commonwealth, one must first look back, over 2 centuries before the Great War, to the very crucible in which their founding nation was forged. The original Minutemen were not a standing army. They were farmers, blacksmiths, merchants, and laborers. They were citizens first and soldiers second, a civilian militia born of necessity in the British colonies of North America. Their name was their doctrine. They were trained to be ready for battle at a minute's notice. This was not a force of conquest or imperial ambition. It was a mechanism of local defense, an embodiment of the idea that a community's safety was the responsibility of the community itself. They were the armed citizenry, a bulwark against what they perceived as the tyranny of a distant, centralized power. This historical precedent was more than just a quaint piece of colonial history. It was a foundational mythos, a story of populist uprising that resonated deep within the cultural DNA of the region. The tales of farmers taking up their muskets to face the most powerful army on earth, of a decentralized network of militias coordinating to defy an empire, became a powerful symbol. It represented a victory of the common person over the entrenched institution, of liberty over authority. It was a story of David and Goliath, played out not by a single hero, but by a collective of ordinary people who chose to act. This spirit, this narrative of self-determination, would lie dormant for centuries, buried under the progress and complexities of the modern world, waiting for a time when it would be needed once more. Before the bombs fell, the Commonwealth was a jewel of American ingenuity and intellectualism. It was a hub of advanced research, home to prestigious universities and cutting-edge technology firms. The region buzzed with the promise of the future, from robotics and artificial intelligence to breakthroughs in nuclear energy. But beneath this gleaming surface of progress, the same societal anxieties that gripped the rest of the nation were festering. The pressures of the ongoing resource wars, the escalating tensions with China, and the increasingly authoritarian measures taken by the federal government created an atmosphere of paranoia and fear. The promise of a technological utopia was shadowed by the ever-present threat of nuclear annihilation. In the years leading up to the Great War, the people of the Commonwealth, like people everywhere, were caught between the dazzling promises of tomorrow and the terrifying realities of today. They saw automated servants in their homes and fusion-powered cars on their streets, but they also saw armed soldiers at checkpoints and heard the constant drone of civil defense sirens. This dichotomy created a unique cultural environment. There was a fierce pride in their region's intellectual and technological supremacy, but also a deep-seated independent streak, a historical distrust of overreaching authority that harkened back to their colonial roots. They were innovators and academics, but they were also the descendants of revolutionaries. When the bombs finally fell on that fateful day in October of 2077, the gleaming towers of progress were transformed into concrete and steel tombs. The centers of learning became irradiated ruins, and the carefully constructed society of the old world was vaporized in an instant. The survivors who emerged from their shelters and basements found a world that was not just broken, but fundamentally alien. The laws of man were gone, replaced by the single brutal law of survival. The initial years were a chaotic scramble for resources, a desperate and bloody period where the only community was the one you could defend with a gun. For over a century, the Commonwealth was a patchwork of isolated, fortified settlements, each a tiny island of fragile order in a sea of radioactive chaos. Communities like Diamond City, built in the ruins of a pre-war baseball stadium, or Good Neighbor, a haven for outcasts and criminals, managed to carve out a semblance of civilization. But they were exceptions. For most, life was a daily struggle against raider gangs, horrifyingly mutated creatures, and the lingering poison of the land itself. There was no central government, no regional authority to enforce laws or protect the weak. Every settlement was on its own, its survival dependent on the height of its walls and the number of its guns. It was in this fractured and dangerous landscape around the year 2180 that the idea of the Minutemen was reborn. The exact circumstances of their founding are lost to the fragmented histories of the wasteland, but the core concept was a direct echo of their colonial predecessors. A group of settlements, tired of living in constant fear, decided to band together for mutual protection. They resurrected the old name and the old promise. They would not be a government. They would not levy taxes or impose laws. They were a voluntary defense pact. If a settlement was attacked by raiders, they could call for aid, and the Minutemen from neighboring communities would come. The revived Minutemen were an elegant solution to a complex problem. In a world without the infrastructure for a standing army or a centralized police force, they created a decentralized network of security. Their strength was not in numbers or in advanced technology, but in their responsiveness and their presence throughout the Commonwealth. Every participating settlement contributed to the collective security. A farmer with a pipe rifle in one settlement was part of the same protective body as a trader with a laser pistol in another. They were a symbol of hope, proof that cooperation was not only possible, but was the most effective tool for survival. For a time, it worked. The Minutemen grew in influence and prestige. Their presence deterred the larger, more organized raider gangs and helped secure trade routes between settlements. They became the de facto peacekeepers of the Commonwealth, their reputation built on countless small victories and acts of bravery. Their leadership was informal, often falling to the most respected and capable individuals who could command the trust of the various settlement militias. One of the most significant steps in their formalization was the establishment of a central command and armory at a formidable pre-war coastal fortress, a star-shaped bastion known as the Castle. The castle became the heart of the Minutemen. From this strategic location, they could coordinate their activities, store supplies, and broadcast a radio signal of hope across the wastes, Radio Freedom. The station played colonial-era music and broadcast news about Minutemen activities, serving as both a recruitment tool and a morale booster. It was a constant reminder to the scattered people of the Commonwealth that they were not alone, that there was an organization dedicated to their protection. The general of the Minutemen, operating from the castle, was the closest thing the region had to a unified leader. However, the decentralized nature of the Minutemen, while their greatest strength, was also a source of inherent weakness. Their power depended entirely on the willingness of individual settlers to answer the call. If settlements became too complacent, too fearful, or too self-interested, the network could falter. The organization was also susceptible to internal politics. As they grew from a simple defense pact into a more structured entity, disagreements arose over leadership and direction. The final general before the organization's collapse, a man named Joe Becker, struggled to maintain unity. His leadership was competent, but the faction was becoming unwieldy, a victim of its own success. The death of General Becker in 2282 marked the beginning of the end. He was killed defending a settlement, a noble end for a leader of his stature, but his death created a power vacuum. Without his unifying presence, the internal squabbles that had been simmering beneath the surface boiled over. Different factions within the Minutemen vied for control, and the spirit of selfless cooperation began to erode, replaced by suspicion and ambition. The organization became paralyzed by indecision. They could no longer present a united front, and their enemies, particularly the increasingly bold raider gangs and the professional mercenaries known as the Gunners, began to sense weakness. The tipping point, the event that would shatter the Minutemen and reduce their legacy to a bitter memory, came at a southern port town. The town, a once thriving settlement, had fallen on hard times, but was still a vital part of the Minutemen network. It was here that the Gunners, a ruthless and well-equipped mercenary company with a rigid command structure that stood in stark contrast to the Minutemen's loose organization, decided to make a statement. They laid siege to the town, overwhelming its local defenses with superior numbers, training, and firepower. The call for help went out, the desperate plea echoing from the town's radio transmitters. The Minutemen responded, but not as a unified force. Instead of a coordinated relief effort, disparate groups of Minutemen trickled into the meat grinder. Among them was a contingent from the castle, led by a man named James Hollis. He was a good man, a believer in the cause, but he was walking into a trap. Another key figure on the ground was a Minuteman named Clint, a man whose loyalty, it would turn out, had a price. As the battle for the southern port raged, the situation grew increasingly desperate. Hollis and his people fought valiantly, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. The Gunners were systematic, professional killers, and they were tightening the noose. It was then that the betrayal occurred. Clint, seeing the battle as a lost cause and likely tempted by a promise of payment or simple survival from the Gunners, turned on his own. He and a handful of his followers abandoned their posts, effectively collapsing a key defensive flank and allowing the Gunners to pour into the heart of the town. But it was worse than simple desertion. According to the accounts of the few who survived, Clint and his men actively sabotaged the defense, locking gates behind them and spreading misinformation to sow chaos. It was a devastating act of treachery that sealed the town's fate. Inside the besieged town hall, Hollis and the remaining Minutemen, along with a group of terrified civilians, made their last stand. Among them was a young, idealistic sergeant, a man who had dedicated his life to the Minutemen's creed. He had watched in horror as the defense crumbled, as friends and comrades were cut down, and as the promise of mutual aid died in a hail of gunfire. He listened to the final desperate radio transmissions from Hollis, who pleaded for reinforcements that would never come. Hollis's last broadcast was not a cry for help, but a bitter condemnation of the Minutemen who had failed to show up, who had let politics and fear prevent them from honoring their oath. The gunners overran the town hall. The slaughter was immense. Hollis and his loyalists were killed, along with nearly every civilian who had sought refuge there. The southern port became a grim monument to failure, an event that would forever be known as the Quincy Massacre. The name itself became a curse, a synonym for betrayal and the death of an ideal. The young sergeant was one of the very few Minutemen to escape the massacre. He led a small, traumatized group of survivors away from the burning town, his heart heavy with the weight of what he had witnessed. He was the last of his unit, perhaps one of the last true believers. The news of the massacre and Clint's betrayal shattered what little remained of the Minutemen's unity. The trust that had been the bedrock of the organization was gone, replaced by paranoia and recrimination. The Minutemen at the castle, hearing of the disaster and fearing they were next, lost their nerve. In a final, desperate act of self-preservation that ironically destroyed the heart of their organization, they abandoned the fortress. They left behind the armory, the radio transmitter, and the legacy of generations of Minutemen. The castle was overrun, not by an army, but by the creeping horrors of the wasteland. A nest of giant irradiated sea creatures claimed the fortress, its crumbling walls becoming a symbol of the Minutemen's own decay. In the wake of the Quincy Massacre and the fall of the castle, the Minutemen ceased to exist as a functional organization. The name became an object of scorn and pity. Settlers who had once looked to the Minutemen for protection now saw them as failures, cowards who had abandoned them in their time of need. To declare oneself a Minuteman was to invite ridicule or even hostility. The dream of a united Commonwealth, protected by its own citizens, was dead. The region fell back into the familiar pattern of fear and isolation, the darkness deepening as the last light of organized hope was extinguished. The hopeful sergeant, Preston Garvey, was now a man adrift. He and his small band of survivors, a mix of civilians and former Minutemen, were refugees, wandering the hostile Commonwealth with no destination and little hope. For him, the failure was personal. He was the last Minuteman, or so it felt. The creed that he had built his life around had turned to ash in his mouth. He carried the weight of every person who had died at Quincy, every settlement that was now left defenseless, every ideal that had been betrayed. His journey was a slow, grinding retreat, a tour of the Commonwealth's despair. They traveled from town to town, seeking shelter, supplies, and a safe place to rest. But everywhere they went, they were met with closed doors and suspicious eyes. The story of Quincy had spread far and wide. The name Minuteman was poison. Some settlers were too afraid to help, fearing that offering sanctuary to the survivors would draw the attention of the gunners or raider gangs. Others were simply bitter, seeing Preston and his group not as refugees, but as painful reminders of a broken promise. Each rejection was another blow to Preston's already shattered spirit. He was trying to protect the last remnants of the community he had sworn an oath to, but the world seemed determined to see them all dead. The group was whittled down by the wasteland's relentless attrition. Some were picked off by feral ghouls in the ruins of old towns. Others fell to raider ambushes on the broken highways. Sickness and starvation claimed more. With each loss, Preston's burden grew heavier. He saw himself as a failure of a leader, unable to protect even this small flock. The idealism that had once burned so brightly within him was reduced to a cold, hard knot of despair in his stomach. He was just going through the motions, driven by a stubborn refusal to lie down and die. But the hope was gone. He was a ghost, haunted by the past and with no vision of a future. Finally, with only a handful of survivors left, they stumbled upon the town of Concord. It seemed like a potential sanctuary, a place to hole up and regroup. But like everywhere else, trouble found them. A gang of raiders recently arrived in the area had also set their sights on the town. Preston and his people were pinned down in the Museum of Freedom, a building ironically dedicated to the very revolutionary history the Minutemen had sought to emulate. They were trapped, surrounded, and running out of ammunition. It was Quincy all over again, a smaller, more pathetic echo of the massacre that had broken him. This, he thought, was the end. The last Minuteman would die in a dusty museum, his final promise to his people unfulfilled. It was at this moment of absolute despair that something impossible happened. From the roof of the museum, Preston saw a figure emerge from a nearby vault. The figure, clad in the simple blue jumpsuit of a vault dweller, was a complete unknown, a ghost from the old world. This person, the sole survivor of a pre-war cryogenic experiment, possessed skills and a resilience forged in a different time. In a desperate bid for help, Preston called out to the stranger, offering a laser musket and a sliver of his story. He didn't expect much. Why would a stranger risk their life for a lost cause? But the stranger took the rifle, and more importantly, they fought back. The sole survivor, with a proficiency that bordered on the supernatural, systematically dismantled the raider threat. They moved with a purpose and lethality that Preston hadn't seen in years. When the dust settled, the raiders were dead, and the museum was secure. For the first time since Quincy, someone had answered the call for help. It was a small act in the grand scheme of things, but for Preston Garvey, it was everything. A single spark of hope was rekindled in the darkness of his despair. He saw in this stranger from the past not just a capable warrior, but a potential leader. Someone who could succeed where the Minutemen had failed. Preston explained his situation, his voice heavy with the weariness of his long ordeal. He spoke of the Minutemen, of what they were supposed to be, and of their fall from grace. He asked the sole survivor for one more act of assistance, to help him lead his people to a place called Sanctuary Hills, a ruined pre-war suburb that the sole survivor, by a strange twist of fate, once called home. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot he had left. The sole survivor agreed. The small group, now with a powerful new protector, made their way through the dangerous territory to the relative safety of the ruined cul-de-sac. Sanctuary Hills was a wreck, but it was defensible. It had a water source and the skeletons of pre-war houses that could be fortified. It was a new beginning. With the immediate danger past, Preston saw a larger opportunity. He saw the potential for the sole survivor to do more than just save his small group. He saw the chance to rebuild the Minutemen from the ground up. He named the sole survivor the new general of the Minutemen. It was a title with no army, no authority, and a legacy of failure. It was an appeal, a desperate gamble on the character of this one individual. "There's a lot of people out there who need our help," he said. "I can't do it alone." The sole survivor, whether out of a sense of duty, a desire for purpose in this new world, or simple compassion, accepted the role. The first task was simple, yet monumental, to prove that the Minutemen were back. Preston had received a distress call from a nearby settlement, 10 Pines Bluff. They were being terrorized by a raider gang. It was a test. Could the new general make the promise of the Minutemen mean something again? The general traveled to the small, struggling farm. They listened to the settlers' plight, a story Preston had heard 100 times before. But this time, the story would have a different ending. The general went to the raider outpost, a satellite array swarming with violent thugs. The battle was swift and brutal. The leader was eliminated, the gang scattered. The general returned to Ten Pines Bluff with the news. The relief and gratitude of the settlers was palpable. They pledged their allegiance to the new Minutemen, agreeing to provide food and resources to the growing network. It was the first link in a new chain. One success would not erase the shame of Quincy, but it was a start. It was proof of concept. The Minutemen could work if they had a leader willing to do the work. Preston's demeanor began to change. The haunted, weary look in his eyes was slowly being replaced by a glimmer of his old idealism. Each time the general returned from a successful mission, Preston's hope grew stronger. The process was repeated again and again. A distress call would come in from Oberlin Station, from Abernathy Farm, from Greentop Nursery. Each was a small community struggling against the horrors of the wasteland. Each time, the general would respond. They would clear out feral ghouls from a water treatment plant, eliminate super mutants from a factory, or persuade a new settlement to join the cause through diplomacy. With each victory, the network expanded. The settlements weren't just being saved, they were being connected. They began to share resources, establish trade routes under the protection of Minutemen patrols, and contribute to the common defense. The general encouraged them to build defenses, to arm themselves, to become active participants in their own security. This was the core of the Minutemen philosophy, now being put into practice with a rigor and effectiveness that the old Minutemen, mired in their political squabbles, had never achieved. The general was not just a warrior. They were a community organizer, a nation builder operating on a grassroots level. The primary tool of this new network was deceptively simple: the flare gun. It was a pre-war piece of emergency equipment, repurposed into the cornerstone of a decentralized military strategy. When a settlement came under attack, they would fire a flare into the sky. The bright red symbol, visible for miles, was a call to arms. Any Minutemen in the area, including the general, would see it and respond. It was a system that relied on trust and proximity, turning the scattered nature of the settlements from a weakness into a strength. There was no need for a complex command structure or long-range communications. The call was simple, and the response was immediate. As the Minutemen's reputation grew, so did their numbers. More settlers volunteered to take up the name and the responsibility. People began to talk about the Minutemen, not with scorn, but with a renewed sense of hope. They were no longer the failures of Quincy. They were the defenders of Ten Pines Bluff, the saviors of Abernathy Farm. The narrative was changing, rewritten one good deed at a time. The general's actions were proving that the ideal was not flawed, only its previous execution. But the ghosts of the past still lingered. The greatest symbol of the Minutemen's former glory and subsequent failure remained lost: the castle. The coastal fortress was still infested, its powerful radio transmitter silent, its armory sealed. Preston knew that for the Minutemen to be truly reborn, they had to reclaim their heart. To retake the castle would be more than just a strategic victory. It would be a profound symbolic act. It would be a declaration to the entire Commonwealth that the Minutemen were not just back, but were stronger than ever. It was a daunting task, one that the old Minutemen in their final days had been too afraid to even attempt. The general, understanding the importance of the task, agreed to lead the assault. Preston gathered a volunteer force, a small but determined group of Minutemen, their faces a mixture of fear and resolve. As they prepared for the mission, an old woman appeared in Sanctuary Hills. Her name was Ronnie Shaw. She was a veteran of the old Minutemen, a grizzled, no-nonsense warrior who had been there before the fall. She had heard the stories of the new general and had come to see for herself if the rumors were true. She was skeptical, her heart hardened by the betrayal and collapse she had witnessed. Ronnie Shaw was a living link to the Minutemen's past. She knew the castle's layout, its secrets, and its weaknesses. More importantly, she knew the location of the sealed West Armory, a hidden cache of weapons, schematics, and equipment that had been locked away by the last commander. She believed that if the castle could be retaken, the armory held the key to the Minutemen's future strength. She offered her expertise, but made it clear she was not easily impressed. The general would have to prove their worth not just to Preston's idealism, but to her hardened pragmatism. The assault on the castle was a brutal affair. The fortress was crawling with mirelurks, their hard shells resistant to small arms fire. The battle raged through the courtyard, the Minutemen volunteers fighting with a desperate courage. But the true challenge lay in the heart of the fortress. A monstrous mirelurk queen, a behemoth of chitin and fury, had made its nest within the castle's walls. It was a creature of nightmare, spitting acid and commanding swarms of its offspring. It was a physical manifestation of the decay that had consumed the Minutemen, a guardian of their failure. The battle against the Queen was a climactic struggle. The general used every tactical advantage, every bit of firepower they could muster. The Minutemen volunteers, inspired by their leader's courage, held the line. Finally, after a tremendous fight, the beast was slain. Its massive body collapsed in the center of the courtyard, a symbolic victory over the rot of the past. The castle was theirs. A cheer went up from the exhausted but triumphant Minutemen. They had done the impossible. They had reclaimed their home. With the fortress secured, Ronnie Shaw led the general to the sealed entrance of the West Armory. It was blocked by rubble, requiring a bit of clever engineering to clear. Inside, they found a treasure trove. There were stockpiles of advanced weaponry, armor, and most importantly, the schematics for building artillery pieces. This was the game changer. The artillery was the ultimate expression of the Minutemen's doctrine of mutual defense. A single artillery piece, placed in a settlement, could provide fire support to any other location within its range. The plan was ambitious. The general would oversee the construction of artillery batteries in settlements across the Commonwealth. Each battery would be manned by Minutemen volunteers. When the general needed fire support on a distant battlefield, they could throw a special smoke grenade. The nearest artillery crew would see the smoke's coordinates relayed to them and unleash a devastating barrage on that position. It was a system that turned the entire network of settlements into an interconnected fortress. An attack on one location could be answered with firepower from 5 others. Ronnie Shaw took charge of training the new artillery crews, her skepticism replaced by a grudging respect for the general's capabilities. The Minutemen began the arduous task of building and deploying these powerful weapons. It was a massive undertaking, requiring significant resources and coordination. But the promise of such overwhelming defensive power motivated the settlers. They worked tirelessly, eager to contribute to a system that would guarantee their safety in a way they had never before imagined. At the same time, work began on repairing the castle's powerful radio transmitter. When the switch was finally thrown, the familiar colonial tunes of Radio Freedom once again broadcast across the Commonwealth. But this time, the broadcasts were different. They weren't just pleas for help or reports of raider sightings. They were announcements of victories. They told the stories of settlements being fortified, of artillery being brought online, of a Commonwealth that was uniting. The voice of the radio was no longer a whisper of hope. It was a confident declaration of strength. The reclamation of the castle and the establishment of the artillery network marked a new era for the Minutemen. They had evolved. They were no longer just a reactive militia, rushing to put out fires. They were a proactive, strategic force capable of area denial and overwhelming fire support. Their power was still decentralized, still rooted in the voluntary cooperation of the common people, but it was now amplified by technology and a unified, effective leadership. They had become the single most powerful military and political force in the Commonwealth. It was at this point, as the Minutemen were consolidating their power, that the other major players in the region could no longer ignore them. The Commonwealth was not an empty stage. 3 other factions, each with a powerful ideology and significant resources, were vying for control. Their goals and methods were fundamentally at odds with the Minutemen's philosophy, and a collision was inevitable. These factions were the Brotherhood of Steel, the Railroad, and the Secretive Institute. The Brotherhood of Steel arrived in the Commonwealth in dramatic fashion, aboard a massive airship called the Pridwin. They were a technologically advanced, quasi-religious military order with a clear and rigid mission: to seize and control all advanced technology, which they believed was too dangerous for humanity to possess. Led by the young and zealous elder Arthur Maxson, this new iteration of the Brotherhood was more aggressive and xenophobic than some of its predecessors. They saw the wasteland not as a place to rebuild, but as a cesspool of mutation and technological heresy that needed to be purged. The Brotherhood's ideology was the antithesis of the Minutemen's. Where the Minutemen sought to empower the common people, the Brotherhood sought to disarm them. Where the Minutemen believed in self-governance, the Brotherhood believed in a strict, hierarchical chain of command. They viewed the settlers of the Commonwealth with contempt, seeing them as ignorant savages incapable of responsibly wielding technology. They would protect humanity by placing it under their thumb, confiscating any technology more advanced than a simple pipe gun and hoarding it for themselves. Their vision of order was one of imposed authority, not cooperative freedom. Then there was the Railroad, a clandestine organization with a single obsessive focus: rescuing and liberating synths, the biomechanical androids created by the Institute. The Railroad operated in the shadows, using a network of safe houses and covert agents. Their leader, a woman named Desdemona, was driven by a passionate belief that synths were sentient beings deserving of freedom. While their goal was noble, their methods were secretive and their focus incredibly narrow. They cared little for the plight of the average human settler, unless it directly intersected with their mission to save synths. The Railroad's philosophy was one of espionage and subterfuge. They were spies, not soldiers or governors. They had no plan for the Commonwealth, no vision for a post-war society beyond the liberation of their synthetic charges. Their contribution to the region's stability was negligible, and their secrecy often bred paranoia and mistrust. They were a single-issue faction, and while their cause was just in the eyes of their members, it did nothing to address the larger problems of raiders, mutants, and starvation that plagued the human population. They were a necessary thorn in the side of the Institute, but they offered no blueprint for a better future for everyone else. Finally, there was the Institute, the boogeyman of the Commonwealth. For generations they were a myth, a terrifying legend whispered around campfires. People would vanish in the night, only to be replaced by perfect synthetic duplicates. The Institute was blamed for every unexplained disappearance, every stroke of bad luck. They were the secret masters of the wasteland, manipulating events from their hidden underground base. The truth, when it was finally revealed, was both more mundane and more horrifying than the legends. The Institute was the direct descendant of the Commonwealth's pre-war scientific community, the scientists and researchers of the CIT who had survived the Great War in a sealed underground laboratory. For 2 centuries, they had advanced their knowledge in isolation, achieving incredible breakthroughs in robotics, artificial intelligence, and teleportation. They were the creators of the synths, but their isolation had bred a profound and monstrous arrogance. Led by a man known only as Father, they viewed the surface world as a lost cause, a failed experiment that was beyond saving. They saw the people of the Commonwealth not as fellow human beings, but as lab rats, subjects for their experiments and obstacles to their grand designs. The Institute's goal was to redefine humanity, to replace the flawed, chaotic world of the surface with their own sterile, controlled vision of the future. They saw themselves as the sole inheritors of the Earth, the only ones with the intelligence and vision to guide humanity's destiny. They kidnapped surface dwellers for their genetic material, unleashed synthetic monstrosities to test their combat capabilities, and manipulated settlements to ensure they never grew powerful enough to challenge them. Their tyranny was not one of open conquest, but of insidious, invisible control. They were the ultimate expression of centralized, unaccountable power, an ivory tower of scientists who had appointed themselves gods and judged the rest of humanity unworthy. These 3 factions represented the great ideological temptations of the post-apocalyptic world. The Brotherhood offered order through technological feudalism. The Railroad offered a narrow, righteous crusade at the expense of the bigger picture. The Institute offered a technologically advanced utopia, but only for a chosen few, built on the suffering and exploitation of the many. Into this volatile mix stood the Minutemen, offering a 4th, far more radical idea, that people could govern themselves. The initial interactions between the Minutemen and the Brotherhood were tense, but not immediately hostile. The Brotherhood, seeing the Minutemen as a ragtag peasant militia, largely dismissed them. They were focused on what they considered the real threats, the super mutants and the Institute. They even offered the general a place within their ranks, seeing the sole survivor's combat prowess as a useful asset. However, they made their disdain for the Minutemen's core philosophy clear. Elder Maxon could not comprehend a military force without a rigid hierarchy, without unquestioning obedience. The idea of a general who took advice from farmers and answered to the people they protected was absurd to him. A key point of friction was the Brotherhood's policy of confiscating resources from settlements. Brotherhood patrols would often march onto a farm and demand a portion of its harvest, claiming it was a necessary tithe for the protection they offered. From the Brotherhood's perspective, this was logical. Their war effort required supplies. From the settlers' perspective, it was extortion, no different from what raiders did, just with cleaner uniforms and a more sanctimonious attitude. The general was often forced to intervene, negotiating tense standoffs between proud farmers and arrogant Brotherhood knights. Each of these incidents frayed the fragile peace, revealing the unbridgeable gap between their worldviews. The conflict with the Institute was, from the beginning, far more fundamental. The Institute represented everything the Minutemen stood against. They were a secret, unaccountable power that preyed on the common people. The stories of kidnappings and replacements were not myths. They were a deliberate strategy of terror and control. For the Minutemen, whose entire purpose was the protection of the Commonwealth settlements, the Institute was the ultimate enemy. They were the wolf that stalked the flock, and the general was the shepherd. The existence and location of the Institute were revealed through the general's personal quest to find their own stolen child, a quest that became inextricably linked with the fate of the entire Commonwealth. The revelation that the Institute's leader, father, was in fact the general's own long-lost son, now an old man, was a moment of profound psychological and moral crisis. Father offered the general a place at his side, a chance to lead the Institute and guide humanity's future from within their sterile paradise. It was a tempting offer, to trade the dirt and struggle of the surface for a world of clean rooms, advanced technology, and absolute power. The general's rejection of this offer was a defining moment for the Minutemen. By turning their back on the Institute, the general was making a definitive statement. They were choosing the flawed, struggling, but free people of the Commonwealth over the sterile, controlled perfection of the Institute. They were choosing the democratic ideal of the Minutemen over the technocratic tyranny of their own son. It was a choice that made war inevitable. The Institute could not tolerate a unified, defiant surface world, and the Minutemen could not tolerate the Institute's continued existence. The first major confrontation came at a place called Bunker Hill. The historic monument had become a major trading hub, a nexus of caravan routes. The Institute planned to raid the settlement to recapture a group of escaped synths who were being sheltered there by the railroad. The Brotherhood also got involved, seeking to destroy the synths and confront the Institute forces. The Minutemen were called in to protect the settlement and its people. The result was a chaotic three-way battle, a microcosm of the entire Commonwealth conflict. In the smoky ruins of Bunker Hill, the general had to make a choice. They could side with the Brotherhood, the railroad, or stand for the people of the Commonwealth alone. By choosing to prioritize the safety of the civilians and driving both the Institute and the Brotherhood forces out of the settlement, the general solidified the Minutemen's position. They were not just another army fighting for territory or ideology. They were the defenders of the people, first and foremost. The battle was a costly victory, but it sent a clear message. The Commonwealth was under Minutemen protection, and they would not be bullied by any faction, no matter how powerful. The Institute, enraged by this public defiance and the general's continued disruption of their operations, decided that the Minutemen had to be eliminated. They saw the decentralized network not as a primitive militia, but as a dangerous insurgency that threatened their control. Their target was obvious: the castle. The fortress was the symbol of the Minutemen's rebirth, the heart of their command and communication network. By destroying the castle, the Institute hoped to decapitate the Minutemen and send the Commonwealth spiraling back into fear and chaos. The Institute's attack on the castle was a massive, coordinated assault. Using their teleportation technology, they bypassed the outer defenses and began beaming in wave after wave of synths directly into the fortress courtyard. It was a terrifying display of their technological superiority. The Minutemen defenders, a mix of seasoned volunteers and newly recruited settlers, were suddenly locked in a desperate, close-quarters battle for their lives. The alarms blared, and the call for aid went out across the network. This was the ultimate test of the Minutemen's new model. The general stood on the ramparts of the castle, organizing the defense. Ronnie Shaw barked orders, her veteran experience proving invaluable. Preston Garvey, the man who had seen the Minutemen's last stand at Quincy, now fought with the fire of a true believer, determined not to let history repeat itself. But they were outnumbered, and the synths were relentless, unfeeling killing machines. The walls that had held against a Mire queen began to feel like they were closing in. But then, the promise was kept. On the horizon, flares shot into the sky from Allied settlements. The network was responding. And then came the thunder. The artillery batteries that the general had so painstakingly established across the Commonwealth opened fire. Shells screamed overhead and began to rain down upon the castle's courtyard, not targeting the defenders, but the staging areas where the Institute was beaming in its forces. The explosions tore through the ranks of the synths, disrupting their teleportation signals and turning their technological advantage into a liability. The battle for the castle was the reverse of Quincy. At Quincy, the Minutemen had failed to show up, their promise broken. At the castle, the entire Commonwealth showed up. The artillery barrage was the physical manifestation of mutual support. Every shell that landed was a farmer from Abernathy, a trader from Bunker Hill, a mechanic from Oberlin Station, all fighting together. The Institute's cold, calculated assault was being shattered by the hot, chaotic, and utterly determined will of a united people. The tide of the battle turned. The relentless waves of synths faltered under the constant bombardment. The Minutemen defenders, emboldened by the support, rallied and pushed the attackers back. The general led a final desperate charge, cutting down the remaining synths. As the last machine fell, a stunned silence descended, broken only by the crackle of fires and the groans of the wounded. They had held. The castle stood. The Minutemen had faced the full might of the Institute and had won. The victory at the castle was more than just a successful defense. It was a turning point in the history of the Commonwealth. It proved beyond any doubt that the Minutemen's decentralized model of defense worked. It proved that a well-organized and motivated populace could stand against a technologically superior foe. For the Institute, it was a catastrophic failure. They had believed the surface dwellers to be weak, divided, and easily broken. They had underestimated the power of an idea. The general knew that this was not the end. The Institute, while wounded, was still a threat. They would retreat to their underground bunker, rebuild their forces, and try again. A defensive victory was not enough. To secure a lasting peace for the Commonwealth, the Institute had to be dealt with permanently. The Minutemen had to go on the offensive. They had to take the fight to the enemy's home, to the heart of their power. They had to do what was once thought impossible: find a way into the Institute and destroy it. The plan was audacious, a feat of wasteland engineering that would require the cooperation of the entire Minutemen network. The Institute was accessible only by their own teleportation technology. To get in, the Minutemen would have to hijack their signal. This required building a complex device, a signal interceptor, that could tap into the Institute's molecular relay. The schematics were complex, requiring expertise that the Minutemen alone did not possess. The general was forced to seek help from the other factions. It was a moment of pragmatism, using the knowledge of their rivals to achieve their own goals. The construction of the signal interceptor became a massive project, drawing on the resources of every settlement allied with the Minutemen. Scrap metal was hauled from ruins, copper wire was stripped from old buildings, and power generators were jury-rigged to provide the immense energy required. It was a community effort on an unprecedented scale. As the device took shape, it became a symbol of the Commonwealth's defiance, a testament to their resourcefulness and determination. It was their answer to the Institute's polished, sterile technology, a messy, powerful, and undeniably human creation. While the interceptor was being built, the Minutemen also had to contend with the Brotherhood of Steel. Elder Maxon, seeing the Institute's attack on the castle and the Minutemen's victory, grew increasingly hostile. He saw the Minutemen not as allies, but as rivals. Their control of the artillery network, a powerful piece of military technology, was a direct violation of the Brotherhood's doctrine. He issued an ultimatum. The Minutemen were to surrender their technology and submit to Brotherhood authority. When the general refused, Maxson declared the Minutemen enemies of the Brotherhood. The Brotherhood's massive airship, the Prydwen, became a symbol of oppression, looming in the sky over the Commonwealth. Brotherhood vertibirds began to patrol Minutemen territory, harassing settlements and clashing with Minutemen patrols. It was a war on two fronts. The general had to prepare for the assault on the Institute, while simultaneously defending their territory from the Brotherhood's aggression. It was a testament to the strength of the Minutemen network that they could withstand this pressure. The flare gun system and the artillery network were now used not just against synths and raiders, but against the Brotherhood's vertibirds and power-armored knights. The day of the assault on the Institute finally arrived. The signal interceptor was complete. The general and a hand-picked team of the best Minutemen volunteers gathered around the humming, sparking machine. The plan was to teleport directly into the Institute, locate their nuclear reactor, the source of all their power, and overload it, destroying the entire facility from within. It was a one-way trip, a suicide mission with the fate of the Commonwealth hanging in the balance. As the general stepped onto the platform, Preston Garvey gave a final, firm nod. "Good luck, General," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of fear and unwavering faith. "Give 'em hell." The teleportation was a disorienting flash of light and energy. The general and their team materialized inside the pristine, white corridors of the Institute. The contrast with the grimy, cobbled-together world of the surface was jarring. Everything was clean, sterile, and eerily quiet. But the quiet did not last long. Alarms blared as the Institute's internal security detected the intrusion. Synths swarmed the corridors, and the final battle began. The fight through the Institute was a desperate, running battle through laboratories, bioscience labs filled with horrific experiments, and the advanced manufacturing facilities of the Synth Retention Bureau. The Minutemen fought with the ferocity of people who knew there was no retreat. They were not just fighting for their own lives. They were fighting for every settler, every farmer, every child who had ever lived in fear of the Institute's invisible tyranny. They were the personification of the surface world's rage, brought directly to the doorstep of their oppressors. The climax of the battle took place in the Institute's reactor chamber. Here, the general confronted Father one last time. The old man, weakened by illness, watched as his life's work, his vision for humanity, was about to be torn apart. He pleaded with the general, his own child, to reconsider. He argued that they were destroying humanity's last best hope, but the general's resolve was firm. They had seen the cost of the Institute's hope, the kidnappings, the fear, the callous disregard for human life. The Commonwealth deserved a chance to find its own future, not one dictated from a tomb. The general initiated the reactor overload sequence. A countdown began, the klaxons wailing a final mournful siren song for the Institute. The Minutemen fought their way back to the relay room, their only way out. As they prepared to teleport back to the surface, the general made a final, compassionate choice. They initiated an evacuation broadcast, giving the non-hostile scientists and the non-combatant synths a chance to escape before the end. It was an act that distinguished the Minutemen from their enemies. They were not destroyers for the sake of destruction. They were liberators. The general and the surviving members of their team teleported out just as the reactor went critical. From a safe distance, they watched as the ground shook and a massive explosion erupted from the ruins of the CIT building, the surface entrance to the Institute. A plume of fire and smoke rose into the sky, a funeral pyre for the Commonwealth's boogeyman. The Institute was gone. Their secrets, their arrogance, and their tyranny were buried under a mountain of rubble. The destruction of the Institute sent shockwaves across the Commonwealth, both literal and political. The Brotherhood of Steel, their primary enemy now eliminated, turned their full attention to the Minutemen. For Elder Maxon, the Minutemen's independent victory was an intolerable affront. He saw them as a rogue state, and he decided to crush them once and for all. The Prydwen moved into position, and the Brotherhood launched a full-scale assault on the Minutemen's holdings. The final war for the Commonwealth had begun. The war with the Brotherhood was a clash of titans. It was the Brotherhood's advanced technology, power armor, and vertibirds against the Minutemen's numbers, their decentralized network, and their artillery. Battles erupted across the Commonwealth. Brotherhood knights clashed with Minutemen militia in the streets of ruined cities. Vertibirds dueled with the explosive fury of artillery shells. It was a brutal, destructive conflict that tested the limits of the Minutemen's resolve. The final battle took place at the Brotherhood's main base of operations, the Boston Airport. The Minutemen, using their vast network, mobilized for a massive, coordinated assault. It was the largest force the Commonwealth had seen in a century, a true people's army. Thousands of volunteers drawn from every settlement, armed with everything from pipe rifles to laser muskets, marched on the airport. Above them, the artillery shells of a dozen Allied settlements screamed towards their targets. The assault on the airport was a meat grinder. The Brotherhood, dug in and heavily armed, fought with disciplined ferocity. But they were facing an enemy they couldn't comprehend. They were fighting the entire Commonwealth. For every knight they cut down, 2 more farmers with rifles took their place. The Minutemen swarmed the barricades, their sheer numbers and determination overwhelming the Brotherhood's superior training and equipment. The general led the charge, a symbol of the people's will, pushing ever deeper into the Brotherhood's stronghold. The ultimate goal was the Prydwen. The airship was the heart of the Brotherhood's power and the symbol of their authority. As long as it remained in the sky, the Brotherhood would remain a threat. The Minutemen artillery, which had been so effective against ground targets, now trained its sights on the massive airship. The bombardment was relentless. Shell after shell slammed into the Prydwen's hull, tearing through its armor, crippling its engines. The great beast of steel, once the symbol of untouchable power, began to list, smoke pouring from a dozen wounds. With a final catastrophic explosion, the Prydwen's spine snapped. The airship broke apart in the sky, its flaming wreckage crashing down onto the airport in a spectacular, horrifying display. The death of the Prydwen broke the Brotherhood's morale. Their leader, Elder Maxon, was either killed in the crash or in the final, desperate fighting on the ground. The surviving Brotherhood forces, leaderless and defeated, were scattered. Some surrendered, some fled the Commonwealth, and others fought to the last man. But their power was broken. Their war was over. With the destruction of the Institute and the defeat of the Brotherhood of Steel, the Minutemen stood as the sole undisputed power in the Commonwealth. The railroad, their primary purpose now moot with the destruction of the Institute, faded back into the shadows, their relevance greatly diminished. The Commonwealth was, for the first time in 200 years, free. It was not a freedom granted by a conquering army or a distant government. It was a freedom that had been won by the people themselves. In the aftermath, a new status quo emerged. The Commonwealth did not become a new nation-state in the pre-war sense. The Minutemen did not establish a central government, levy taxes, or create a new bureaucracy. That was never their goal. Instead, the network of allied, self-governing settlements that the general had built became the new model for society. Each settlement managed its own affairs, but they were all united under the banner of the Minutemen for common defense. Trade flourished along the now secure roads. The fear of super mutants, raiders, and the Institute was replaced by a sense of security and optimism. Settlers could focus on rebuilding, on farming and industry, rather than just survival. The Minutemen acted as the connective tissue, the guardians of this new, peaceful era. They were the circuit that connected the disparate lights of civilization, allowing them to shine brighter together than they ever could alone. Radio Freedom's broadcast became a symbol of this new age, reporting on new settlements being founded, new trade agreements being signed, and the ongoing work of making the Commonwealth a better place. The general's role evolved. They were less of a frontline warrior and more of a statesman, a mediator, and a symbol. They traveled the Commonwealth, helping to resolve disputes between settlements, coordinating large-scale rebuilding projects, and ensuring the principles of the Minutemen were upheld. Preston Garvey, now a senior officer in a successful and respected organization, finally found the peace that had eluded him for so long. He saw the ideal he had clung to through the darkest of times made real, and he dedicated himself to preserving it for future generations. Ronnie Shaw, the hardened veteran, continued to oversee the Minutemen's military readiness, her pragmatism a necessary balance to Preston's idealism. The Minutemen's model was not a utopia. It was messy, inefficient at times, and relied heavily on the goodwill and active participation of its members. There were still dangers. Remnant gunner companies, powerful raider gangs, and the mutated horrors of the wasteland still lurked in the dark corners of the world. But the Commonwealth now had a system to deal with them. It had a way to answer the call. The decentralized nature of the Minutemen meant they could not be easily decapitated. There was no single point of failure. The power did not reside in the general or at the castle. It resided in every settlement, in every citizen who was willing to pick up a rifle and stand for their neighbor. This is why the Minutemen represent the best hope for the wasteland. They reject the failed ideologies of the past. They do not seek to hoard technology like the Brotherhood, for they understand that technology is a tool, and its worth is determined by the hands that wield it. They believe those hands should be the hands of the people. They do not operate in the shadows for a narrow cause like the railroad, for they believe that society's problems must be faced openly and collectively. They do not seek to impose a sterile top-down order like the Institute, for they understand that true strength comes from the messy, chaotic, and beautiful resilience of the human spirit. The Minutemen's philosophy is one of empowerment. They do not offer safety in exchange for freedom. They offer the tools and the support for people to achieve safety and freedom for themselves. Their power is borrowed power, granted by the consent of the governed. The general's authority comes not from a pre-war title or a divine right, but from the trust they have earned through their actions. It is a fragile power, one that must be constantly reaffirmed through service to the people. This is the essence of a true democracy, reborn in the ashes of the old world. Their story is a testament to the power of a simple, humane idea. In a world defined by brutality and selfishness, they chose cooperation. In a world of would-be kings and tyrants, they chose to serve. they proved that a viable, thriving society does not require a complex bureaucracy, a secret police, or a technologically advanced elite. It requires only a community, a network of people who believe in each other enough to answer the call. It requires a promise, made and kept, that when one of us is in trouble, we will all be there at a minute's notice. The legacy of the Minutemen is not written in the grand histories of conquerors or kings. It is written in the fields of a thriving farm that was once barren, in the laughter of children in a settlement that was once besieged, and in the quiet confidence of a trader walking a road that was once a death trap. It is a legacy of flickering hope, a demonstration that even after the end of the world, a better world can be built, not by relying on the ghosts of the past, but by placing faith in the hands of the people in the present. In the final analysis, the Minutemen did more than just win a war for the Commonwealth. They gave it back to itself. And in a world torn apart by those who would claim to own it, there is no greater victory. It is worth taking a moment to analyze the profound philosophical shift that the Minutemen's success represents. For 2 centuries, the wasteland had been dominated by factions that were, in essence, trying to recreate or perfect the systems of the pre-war world. The Enclave sought to resurrect the old American government in its most jingoistic and puritanical form. The new California Republic attempted to rebuild a sprawling bureaucratic democracy, complete with its own internal corruption and imperial ambitions. The Brotherhood of Steel clung to a military-industrial hierarchy, and the Institute pursued a technocratic dream of a planned society. All of them, in their own way, were shackled to the past. They were trying to put the old world back together, assuming that its structures were the only ones possible. The Minutemen were different. They did not look to the past for a blueprint, but for an inspiration. They took the spirit of the colonial militia, decentralization, volunteerism, local defense, and adapted it to the realities of the post-nuclear age. They were not building a nation, they were fostering a network. This distinction is crucial. A nation implies borders, a central government, a monopoly on violence, and a passive citizenry that pays taxes in exchange for services. A network, as the Minutemen created it, implies nodes of autonomy, a voluntary pact, a shared responsibility for security, and an active citizenry that provides for its own defense. This model directly addresses the fundamental problem of the wasteland, the tyranny of distance. In a world with shattered infrastructure and no mass communication, a centralized government in a far-off capital becomes an abstraction. Its laws are difficult to enforce, its aid is slow to arrive, and its taxes feel like tribute to a distant power. The new California Republic faced this very problem in the Mojave, where its long supply lines and bureaucratic inertia made it an inefficient and often resented presence. The Minutemen solved this by making governance and security entirely local. The people defending a settlement were the people living in it. The government was their own town meeting. The army was their neighbor with a rifle. This localization of power is a radical act of trust in the common person. The Brotherhood, the Institute, and the Enclave all operated from a position of profound distrust. They believed the average survivor was too stupid, too savage, or too short-sighted to be trusted with power, technology, or their own destiny. The Minutemen operated on the opposite assumption. They believed that ordinary people, when given the means and the motivation, would do the right thing. They would band together, they would defend each other, and they would build a just society from the ground up. The success of the Commonwealth under their protection is the ultimate validation of this faith. Consider the laser musket, the iconic weapon of the Minutemen. It is, in itself, a perfect metaphor for their entire philosophy. It has the form of a pre-war colonial musket, a symbol of their historical inspiration. But its function is based on scavenged post-war technology, a hand-crank capacitor that charges energy cells. It is a weapon of the past and the future, fused together by wasteland ingenuity. It is not the most efficient weapon. It requires the user to manually crank it before each shot, a slow and deliberate process. But this very flaw is also its strength. It uses commonly available energy cells, and its simple, robust design means it can be maintained by anyone with basic repair skills. It is a democratic weapon. It puts the power of laser technology into the hands of the common settler, without the need for a complex industrial base or a secretive technological cult to maintain it. In the same way, the Minutemen's political structure is like the laser musket. It might seem slow and inefficient compared to the Brotherhood's rigid chain of command or the Institute's instantaneous teleportation. A decision might require consensus among multiple settlements. A response might depend on who happens to be close enough to see a flare. But this system is robust. It is resilient. It cannot be destroyed by assassinating a single leader or bombing a single capital. Its power is distributed among hundreds of points, each capable of acting independently, but also of supporting the whole. The story of the Minutemen is also a story of redemption, not just for Preston Garvey, but for the very idea of community. In the years after the bombs, community often meant a wall to hide behind, a group to hoard resources with. It was a defensive and exclusionary concept. The Minutemen redefined it. Under their influence, community became an open, inclusive, and outward-looking concept. A settlement's strength was not just in its own walls, but in its connection to other settlements. The well-being of your neighbor became integral to your own. This is a profound departure from the survivalist mentality that dominates so much of post-apocalyptic fiction and reality. It is also a deeply American story, in the most idealistic sense of that word. It taps into the nation's founding myths of self-reliance, grassroots democracy, and civic duty. But it critically purges those myths of the darker elements that accompanied them in history: the slavery, the genocide, the exclusion. The new Minutemen were open to all: ghouls, reformed raiders, even synths who sought a peaceful life could find a home in a Minutemen settlement. Their community was defined not by blood or origin, but by a shared commitment to mutual defense and a better future. They took the promise of the old world and sought to build a new one, where that promise could be truly fulfilled for everyone. Of course, there are potential pitfalls to their system. What happens when two allied settlements have an intractable land dispute? What happens when a charismatic but malevolent leader rises within a settlement and refuses to abide by the common pact? The decentralized structure lacks a strong central judicial or legislative body to handle such complex civil issues. The general's role as a mediator is crucial, but it relies on the personal authority of one individual. A future without a leader of similar integrity and wisdom could see the network fracture back into rivalry and conflict. This is the inherent fragility of a system built on goodwill. It requires constant vigilance and a continuous renewal of the social contract. But perhaps this is not a weakness, but a strength. It forces the citizens of the Commonwealth to remain engaged. It prevents them from becoming complacent and outsourcing their civic responsibility to a distant government. The health of their society is something they must actively participate in maintaining every single day. Freedom in the Minutemen's Commonwealth is not a static possession. It is a dynamic and ongoing practice. The final confrontation with the Brotherhood of Steel is particularly illustrative of the Minutemen's ideological superiority. The Brotherhood saw the world in black and white, us versus them, the pure versus the corrupt, the technologically enlightened versus the ignorant masses. Their solution to any problem was force. Their answer to any disagreement was dominance. When they faced the Minutemen, they saw a disorganized rabble and assumed an easy victory. They could not process the idea of an army with no uniforms, no formal rank structure beyond a single general, and no motivation other than the defense of their homes. The Brotherhood's power was concentrated. It was in their power armor, their vertibirds, and their massive airship. It was impressive, but it was brittle. By destroying the Prydwen, the Minutemen destroyed the symbol and center of that power, and the entire structure crumbled. The Minutemen's power, in contrast, was diffuse. It was in every farmhouse with a turret on its roof, every settlement with an artillery piece, and every citizen with a flare gun. There was no single target you could hit to make it all fall apart. To defeat the Minutemen, you would have to conquer every single settlement, one by one, an impossible task. You would have to extinguish the idea of freedom in every single heart. In the end, the story of the Minutemen is the ultimate refutation of the great man theory of history. While the general is a pivotal figure, their success is not their own. The general is a catalyst, not a conqueror. They do not impose their will on the Commonwealth. Instead, they awaken a potential that was already there, dormant in the hearts of the people. They give them the organization, the tools, and the inspiration, but the people themselves do the work of building a new world. The general's greatest strength is their ability to make themselves almost unnecessary, to build a system that can, in theory, sustain itself without them. This is a form of leadership rarely seen in the wasteland, a leadership based on humility and service. It is the opposite of Elder Maxon's authoritarian pride, the railroad's clandestine elitism, or father's God complex. It is a leadership that understands that true power is not held, but shared. It is a lesson that the old world, with its bombs and its endless wars for resources and dominance, failed to learn. The Minutemen, by succeeding, offer the wasteland a chance to avoid repeating the same mistakes. They offer a path forward that is not paved with steel and fire, but with community, cooperation, and a stubborn, resilient hope. Theirs is a quiet revolution, fought not for an empire, but for a neighborhood. And that is why they are, and always will be, the best hope for the Commonwealth.